Guys, please like and subscribe and share this video with your friends and family. Also, please tell me from where you're watching. Thanks. It was mid-January and winter had its claws in everything. I'd volunteered for the night shift at work, partly because things at home were a mess, too much noise, too much tension, and partly because I'd always liked the quiet of the office at night. There's something about an empty building that feels calming, or at least that's how I used to feel. The office was part of this older building downtown, a place that seemed like it hadn't been updated in decades. Normally I'd pop on some music, but that night I worked in silence. The world outside felt so muffled from the snow that even the idea of playing music seemed too loud. I just wanted to sink into my work, focus on the steady rhythm of the system updates, and let my mind go quiet for a while. By 2 a.m., the snow outside had turned everything into a soft, white blanket. You couldn't hear any cars or people, just the occasional groan of the heaters and the tapping of my keyboard. I was running through logs, sipping lukewarm coffee, when I heard it, a faint thud. At first, I barely registered. Offices make weird noises, right? A door could have shifted, or maybe the wind rattled something. But after a second, I stopped typing and just listened. The office was silent again, but not in a comforting way. It was that kind of silence where you start hearing your own heartbeat and wondering if it's always been that loud. I shook my head and laughed at myself. "Don't start imagining things," I muttered. But then, just as I started typing again, I heard it. Another sound, louder this time, a sharp metallic clang, like someone dropping a tool on a concrete floor. This time, I froze completely. My hands hovered over the keyboard and I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck. Maintenance had left hours ago, and as far as I knew, I was the only person in the building. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Andy, the night security guy, had come upstairs early. Maybe he was checking the pipes or something. It wasn't like he had a strict routine. Still, I couldn't shake this gnawing feeling in my stomach. Something about the sound didn't feel right. Grabbing my coffee mug like it was some kind of shield, I decided to head to the break room. If Andy was around, I'd run into him. And if I didn't, well, maybe the caffeine would settle my nerves. The hallway felt different that night. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than usual. My reflection in the glass partitions caught my eye, and I had to do a double take. I looked pale, my eyes sunken from too many nights like this one. I felt a little foolish getting so worked up over a noise, but I couldn't shake the tension in my... Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a shadow moved. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no, there was someone there. A man, hunched over, wearing a bulky winter jacket and carrying a bag over his shoulder. For a second, I thought it might be Andy. Who else would it be? But as the figure straightened and started moving, I realized something was off. This wasn't Andy. "Andy?" I called out, my voice shaky. The word echoed down the hallway, bouncing off the walls. The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, completely still, as if he were waiting for something. "Hey!" I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. And then, slowly, he started walking toward me. You know that feeling when your stomach drops like you've missed a step on the stairs? That's what it felt like. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor. "I work here," I managed to say, though my voice came out shaky and thin. "You're not supposed to be on this floor. Can I help you?" He didn't answer. He just kept walking, his steps slow and deliberate. When he got close enough for me to see his face, my heart sank. His skin was pale, and his eyes wouldn't stay still, darting around like he was looking for something or someone. His lips moved slightly, muttering something I couldn't hear. "Where's Andy?" he said suddenly, his voice low and gravelly. "What?" The word barely left my mouth. "Where's Andy?" he repeated, louder this time. His hand reached into the bag slung over his shoulder, and when he pulled it out, I felt the air leave my lungs. It wasn't a tool, or a flashlight, or anything harmless. It was a gun. Time seemed to freeze. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. All I could think was, this can't be happening, this isn't real. But it was. He must have seen the fear in my face, because he gave me this twisted little smile. "Don't worry," he said, almost casually. It's not for you, not unless you make me use it. I don't even know how to describe what I felt in that moment. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe, and my hands were shaking so badly I thought I might drop the coffee mug. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run, but I didn't dare move. "Where's Andy?" he asked again, stepping closer. I noticed something else sticking out of the bag: zip ties. My stomach churned as the realization hit me. This wasn't just some guy who wandered off the street. He had a plan. "I don't know where he is," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "He might be downstairs, checking the parking lot." He tilted his head, like he was deciding whether to believe me. Then, almost as if he were talking to himself, he muttered, "This place owes me." I didn't know what he meant by that, and I didn't care. My only thought was getting out of there alive. Slowly, I started backing away toward the emergency exit, trying to stay calm. I'll go find Andy for you," I said, hoping to distract him. But before he could say anything, the stairwell door creaked open, and Andy's voice boomed down the hallway. "Hey! What's going on here?" I've never been so relieved to hear someone's voice. Andy stepped into view, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. The guy froze, his eyes darting between me and Andy. Then, without a word, he turned and bolted. Andy chased after him, but by the time the cops arrived, the man was long gone. Later we found out he was a former employee who'd been fired months ago for erratic behavior. Apparently he'd been holding a grudge. They said he wasn't dangerous, just unstable. But to this day, I can still hear his voice in my head, calm and casual, saying, "Not unless you make me use it." Now, every time I work late, I double-check every lock on every door. But no matter how careful I am, I can't shake the memory of that man's face, his twisted smile, and the weight of his words. I should have said no when my buddy asked me to cover his shift at the old factory. But, of course, I didn't. He owed me so many beers by that point I figured I might as well cash in on the favor. Big mistake. The factory had been out of commission for years. They kept a skeleton crew around to monitor the boilers and electrical systems that powered some nearby facilities. But really, the place was one bad storm away from collapsing in on itself. It was just me that night, wandering the industrial labyrinth with its endless pipes, crumbling walls, and machines that hummed like they had life support plugged into them. It felt more like babysitting an old ghost than anything else. I clocked in at 11 p.m., bundled in 3 layers because the heaters in the control room were practically useless. Honestly, I wasn't even mad about having to walk my rounds. Moving kept the cold from settling too deep into my bones. But right from the start, something about the night felt different. Not wrong, exactly, but not right either. Like the place was holding its breath, waiting for something. It started in the south wing. I was walking the corridor, keeping my head down and mentally running through my checklist, when the overhead lights started flickering. No surprise there, this place was older than dirt, and the wiring wasn't much better. I sighed, added it to my mental report later list, and was just about to move on when I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, darting across the far end of the hallway. Now, I'm not the jumpy type. I told myself it was probably just a stray. We'd had cats and raccoons sneak in before, squeezing through gaps in the walls or broken vents. Still, something about the way it moved made me pause. It wasn't fast enough to be a cat, but wasn't big enough to be a person either. I stood there for a second, staring down the dim corridor, but there was nothing. Just me, the flickering lights, and the sound of my own breathing. I shook it off. Nothing to get worked up over, I told myself. But as I moved through the building, that feeling, the one where you're not alone, clung to me like a second skin. By the time I got to the boiler room, I was glad for the warmth. The machines hissed and rumbled softly, like an old man muttering under his breath. It wasn't much, but it took the edge off the chill. I did my usual checks, making sure the gauges were steady and there weren't any leaks, and everything seemed fine. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl. At first I thought I'd imagined it. I froze, straining to hear past the rhythmic thrum of the boilers. Nothing. I relaxed a little, telling myself it was just the sound of the machinery. Pipes settling, metal expanding in the heat. But then it came again. Louder this time. Clearer. It wasn't the boilers. I gripped my flashlight tighter, the beam shaking as I swept it across the room. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, almost laughable in the cavernous space. No answer. Just the faint echo bouncing back at me, like the building itself was mocking my nerves. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was my eyes playing tricks on me. Just at the edge of my flashlight beam, something moved. Big. Striped. My stomach did this weird flip-flop thing, and for a second I couldn't even process what I was seeing. A tiger. Standing there, as real as you or me, its yellow eyes locked onto mine. Now, I'm not exactly a wildlife expert, but I can tell you one thing for sure. Tigers don't belong in the middle of a snow-covered factory in the middle of nowhere. It didn't make any sense. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Was there a circus nearby? Some kind of wildlife sanctuary? Did someone's exotic pet escape? But none of that mattered, because the tiger took a step forward, its massive paws silent on the concrete. I didn't stick around to find out what it wanted. I ran. I bolted down the corridor, my boots skidding on patches of ice where the cold had crept in. Behind me, I could hear its claws scraping the floor, a sound so sharp it made my teeth ache. Every hallway looked the same, shadowy and endless. It felt like the factory was working against me, leading me in circles while the tiger got closer. Then I hit a corner too fast. My shoulder slammed into a stack of old barrels, sending them clattering to the floor with a deafening crash. I went down hard, my ankle twisting as I landed. The pain shot up my leg, but I didn't have time to think about it. The growl was louder now, echoing off the walls. I scrambled to my feet, wincing as I limped toward the nearest staircase. The steps were coated in frost, slick and uneven. I half crawled, half stumbled down, my breath coming in ragged gasps. By the time I hit the bottom, I realized I'd made a huge mistake. The basement was a dead end. No exits, no windows, just a graveyard of rusted equipment sitting in ankle-deep water. I killed my flashlight and crouched behind a generator, trying to make myself as small as possible. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might give me away. For a while, there was nothing, just silence, broken only by the faint drip of water from a pipe overhead. I started to think maybe the tiger had given up. Then I heard it, soft, deliberate footsteps splashing in the water. It was here. The tiger padded into the room, its massive form silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through a broken vent. It sniffed the air, slow and methodical, and my stomach churned. I didn't dare move. My fingers dug into the cold, wet concrete, every muscle in my body locked in place. My eyes darted around, searching for anything that could help. That's when I spotted the dripping pipe. It was part of the old sprinkler system, and if I could break it open, the noise might distract the tiger long enough for me to escape. With shaking hands, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small wrench I always carried. It felt absurdly heavy in my trembling grip. Taking a deep breath, I aimed and hurled it at the pipe. The clang was deafening, and a burst of water sprayed out, hissing as it hit the freezing air. The tiger snarled, its attention snapping to the noise. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I crawled toward the far side of the room, where another staircase led up to the main level. My ankles screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I was halfway up the stairs when the tiger roared. A sound so deep and powerful, it felt like it shook the entire building. I didn't look back. I just kept climbing, my lungs burning and my vision blurring. When I reached the top, I slammed the door shut behind me, collapsing against it as my chest heaved. The tiger didn't follow. I don't know if it was the water, the noise, or just dumb luck, but I wasn't about to question it. I hobbled back to the control room, locking every door I could on the way, and called for help. By the time the crew arrived in the morning, the tiger was gone. All that was left were claw marks on the concrete, and one hell of a story. Even now, months later, I can't make sense of it. People laugh when I tell them. They say it's impossible, that I must have been seeing things, but every time I hear the low hum of machinery or catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I'm right back there, feeling its eyes on me, waiting. I never thought a job as a night janitor at Pine Hill School would be anything out of the ordinary. I mean, it was a small town, and Pine Hill was one of those schools where nothing ever really happened. Just a big old building full of classrooms, locker rooms, and hallways that creaked every time you walked down them. After hours, it was always dead quiet, except for the occasional rattle of windows or the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Most nights, it felt like I was the only person in the world, just me and my mop, getting through the rounds, making sure the place was clean and ready for the next day. I was 48 at the time, just coming out of a rough divorce. My life felt like a long string of jobs that didn't really matter, and this was no different. The work was simple enough. Mopping, sweeping, taking out trash. Nothing to get excited about, but it gave me a routine, something stable. And after a few months, that was all I needed. No big surprises, no drama. I was used to the stillness and the quiet, the hum of the lights and the occasional creak of the building as it settled. To me, it was just another night. But that night, that one was different. It had snowed all day, the kind of snow that piles up fast, thick and heavy, turning everything outside into a white blur. By the time I clocked in at 9 p.m., the roads were slick and the wind was howling, making the trees outside look like they were bending under pressure. The parking lot was empty except for my old van, sitting there under a flickering streetlight. The air had a cold bite to it, but I didn't mind. It was just one of those nights where everything felt extra quiet, like the world was holding its breath. I made my way into the building, greeted by that familiar scent of musty hallways and old books. I always started in the gym. The floors were always easy to clean there, and the lights were bright enough that I didn't need to strain my eyes. The waxed hardwood gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the sound of my mop scraping against the floor echoed in the emptiness of the gym. Everything felt like it always did, peaceful, unchanging. But then I heard it tap, tap, tap. At first I thought it was nothing, just the wind maybe. The old building had its quirks, loose pipes, creaky beams, but this was different. The tapping didn't stop. It was rhythmic, like someone was knocking but not on a door. I paused, setting the mop down, listening carefully. Tap, tap, tap. Closer this time. I froze. The gym was empty. I was the only one in the building. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed my flashlight from my utility belt and started walking down the hall, heading toward the sound. The air was cold, colder than usual. The lights above flickered as I walked, casting long, stretching shadows on the walls that made the hallway feel endless. The sound led me down past classrooms and toward the janitor's closet, the one I'd locked myself in just an hour ago. When I got to the door, I noticed it was ajar. I was sure I'd locked it before leaving. I didn't always remember every little thing, but I'd checked. The light inside flickered on and off, like something had been playing with a switch. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady, but the knot in my stomach was already tightening. The tapping stopped immediately. I stood there for a moment, the silence pressing in. I felt like I should walk away, but my curiosity was stronger. It always was. I pushed the door open slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The closet looked normal enough, shelves of cleaning supplies, mops, buckets, but something was off. The air inside was frigid, much colder than the rest of the building. And then I saw them. Footprints, small ones, unmistakable. They were fresh, too fresh to be mine. They led from the back corner of the closet where the supply shelf was, straight to the door. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it. I knew I was alone. The school had been locked up. I'd been the one to lock it. But here they were, tiny prints in the dust, small enough to belong to a child, but there was no way a kid could have gotten in without anyone noticing. I closed the door quickly, my breath catching in my throat. Maybe it was just a rat. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I didn't know, but deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Something didn't sit right. I locked the door again, double-checking the latch, and turned to continue my rounds. But my thoughts kept going back to those prints. The rest of the night felt off, like something was lurking just out of sight. The air grew heavier as I worked through the hallways, colder, almost like I was being watched. The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows, and the tapping, God, the tapping. It came back. this time from the gym. I grabbed my crowbar from the supply closet. I didn't normally need it, but something about tonight felt different. My gut was telling me to be prepared for whatever I was walking into, so I took it. As I approached the gym doors, I felt a strange unease crawling up my spine. I pushed the door open, and the lights overhead blinked out. Complete darkness. I shined the flashlight ahead of me, sweeping the beam across the floor. The gym was empty. The shiny hardwood was smooth and reflective under the beam of light. The court lines crisp and clear. Everything looked normal, but as I scanned the room, my breath caught in my throat. There was something by the bleachers. At first, it didn't make sense. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its limbs, they didn't look right. They were thin, almost too thin, stretched too long. It looked like a person, but not quite. The worst part, though, was its face, or more accurately, the lack of one. There was nothing there, just darkness, like a hole in the air where its head should have been. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted out of there. But instead, I stood there, my body frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. It tilted its head like it was trying to figure me out, studying me from the darkness. The silence in the gym grew thicker, heavier. Then it moved, not like any normal person moves. Its legs bent in the wrong direction, its arms stretching impossibly long, too long. It didn't walk. It slithered, smooth and fluid, like something that didn't belong in the world of the living. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, raising the crowbar, trying to steady my hands. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice sounding small in the vast emptiness of the gym. The thing stopped. I don't know why. Maybe it was toying with me. Maybe it was considering whether or not I was worth the effort. Then, without any warning, it lunged. It happened so fast, I didn't have time to think. I swung the crowbar, the metal connecting with something solid. It wasn't enough. It hissed, a terrible screeching sound like nails on a chalkboard, and in the blink of an eye, it was gone. My flashlight tumbled to the floor, spinning wildly, casting crazy shadows on the walls. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. My breath was ragged, and my chest felt like it was going to explode. I scrambled to get back up, to move, to get away. But by the time I managed to stand, the gym was empty. Empty. I didn't stay to figure out what had just happened. I turned, ran for the exit, my hands shaking so much I could barely get the key in the lock. The tapping, God, the tapping was louder now, echoing through the building like it was coming from all directions. The school felt alive, breathing, shifting. I didn't wait to hear it anymore. I didn't need to. I was out the door and into the snow before I could think. I didn't go back inside. Not that night, not for the rest of my shift. I spent the next few hours sitting in my van, parked under a flickering streetlight, staring at the school from across the lot. I couldn't stop looking at it, knowing that whatever was in there was still watching me. The next day, I called in sick, told my boss I was done. I didn't care if it didn't make sense. I wasn't going back there, not ever. And since then, I've kept my distance. I've heard the rumors, of course, about strange sounds, doors slamming, things moving when no one's around, but none of it compares to what I saw that night. And every now and then, when the night is quiet, when the wind is just right, I still hear it, the tapping, the same rhythmic tapping that started it all. I took the night shift at a convenience store because, well, I didn't really have a choice. Winter was hitting hard that year. Freezing mornings, icy sidewalks, and heating bills that seemed to double overnight. My old car was barely hanging on, coughing and sputtering every time I tried to start it, and my bank account wasn't exactly healthy. The store was only a 10-minute walk from my apartment, and it paid better than I'd expected for what seemed like an easy, no-drama job. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt manageable. Or so I thought. The hours were rough. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., an endless stretch of late-night quiet. I never really got used to the eerie stillness of the store at night. Sometimes I'd stand behind the counter, staring at the clock, just waiting for the hours to crawl by. On the rare occasion someone came in, it was almost a relief, even if they were just there to grab a soda or lottery ticket. Walking home in the dark, though, that was always the hardest part. The streets were empty, and the kind of silence that hung in the air wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that made your skin crawl, like something was just out of sight, watching. But I figured I could handle it. I needed the money, and it wasn't forever. That night started out like any other. It was cold, so cold that every time the automatic doors slid open, a blast of icy air rushed in and made my teeth chatter. I had my usual setup going, a cup of cheap coffee on the counter, earbuds in one ear so I could listen to music while keeping the other ear free for customers. The store was dead, aside from the occasional truck driver or graveyard shift worker popping in. Around 2 a.m. though, I noticed something strange. It started with the smell. At first it was barely noticeable, like a faint whiff of something burnt. I thought maybe someone had used the microwave in the break room and left a mess. Wouldn't have been the first time. But the smell didn't fade. If anything, it got worse. By the time it filled the store, it was sharp and sour, almost metallic, with this underlying rotting edge that made my stomach turn. I tried to ignore it, but it clung to the air, heavy and suffocating, like it was following me around. I decided to investigate. I checked the trash cans first, thinking maybe someone had tossed something gross in there. Nothing. The microwave was spotless for once, and the bathrooms, while not exactly pleasant, didn't seem to be the source either. The smell was everywhere, and it was getting stronger. I felt this weird pressure in my chest, like the air itself was thickening. It was the kind of sensation that makes you feel lightheaded, like you're underwater and running out of breath. The store was empty by then, so I grabbed a rag and some disinfectant spray and started walking the aisles, hoping to find the source. At first, I thought it might be coming from the freezers, but as I moved closer to the toy section, a dusty little corner of the store that no one ever seemed to notice, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, on the tiled floor, was a dark, wet streak. It wasn't big, but it was enough to catch my attention. The smell was stronger there, almost unbearable. I followed the streak to the bottom shelf, where we kept a few cheap toys, knockoff dolls with creepy fixed smiles and remote-controlled cars that never worked properly. The air felt wrong in that corner, heavier somehow, like it was pressing down on me. I crouched down, pulling the shelf slightly away from the wall. That's when I saw it. There was a box shoved into the shadowy space behind the shelf. It was big, maybe 2 feet wide, and taped up so poorly that parts of it were bulging out, the cardboard barely holding together. A dark liquid had seeped through the bottom, forming a sticky puddle underneath. My heart started racing. I wasn't exactly squeamish, but something about this box gave me a bad feeling. A really bad feeling. I grabbed a pair of gloves from under the counter. No way was I touching that thing barehanded, and nudged the box with my foot. It shifted slightly, making this awful wet sound, like stepping in a puddle of mud. And then I heard it. Scratching. It wasn't just scratching, it was frantic, desperate, like whatever was inside was trying to claw its way out. My throat tightened, and I felt this cold wave of panic wash over me. My brain was screaming at me to leave it alone, to walk away, but my curiosity got the better of me. I reached for the broom we kept near the door and gave the side of the box a light shove. The bottom gave out completely. What happened next felt like something out of a nightmare. The box collapsed, spilling out a disgusting mess of shredded paper, droppings, and something slimy that I couldn't even begin to identify. And then came the rats. Dozens of them, maybe more. They poured out like a living tide, squealing and scattering in every direction. Some bolted toward the freezers, others disappeared into the shelves, and a few, God help me, ran straight for me. I screamed, stumbling backward and dropping the broom. One of the rats, a massive one, with matted fur and these horrible yellow teeth, ran across my foot, leaving a streak of grime on my shoe. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grab onto the counter as I climbed on top of it, desperate to get away. The rats were everywhere, their tiny claws scraping against the tiles, their squeals filling the air. I fumbled for my phone and called my manager, straight to voicemail. Typical. I left a panicked message, my voice shaking so much that I barely made sense, and hung up. The smell was unbearable now, a mix of rot, urine, and something sickly sweet that made my stomach churn. I could still hear the rats moving, their claws scratching against the shelves. I stayed on the counter for what felt like hours, too scared to move. When I finally climbed down, I grabbed the mop bucket and started trying to contain the mess. Cleaning it up wasn't an option. I just wanted to stop the smell from spreading. As I was mopping, something shiny caught my eye in the debris. I bent down and picked it up. It was a bracelet. A cheap plastic one with little colorful beads that spelled out a name, Emma. My heart sank. We didn't sell anything like that in the store. Where had it come from? How long had that box been sitting there? My mind raced, each possibility worse than the last. When my manager finally showed up around 5 a.m., he took one look at the scene and just sighed. "Clean it up," he said, like it was no big deal. I tried to explain what had happened, but he barely listened. "And don't bother calling pest control," he added. "We can't afford it right now." That was the last straw for me. I finished my shift, scrubbing the floor until my hands ached, but I knew I wasn't coming back. As I locked up and stepped out into the freezing morning air, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd uncovered something I wasn't supposed to. The walk home was silent except for the crunch of frost under my boots. My breath fogged up in the cold air, but my mind was racing. I kept thinking about the box, about the smell, about the name on that bracelet. Even now, sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can still hear that scratching. The whole experience sits in my memory like a smudge I can't quite rub out, and every time I revisit it, I pick up on details I missed before. Honestly, it's one of those stories that's both fascinating and unsettling, and for better or worse, it stuck with me. It all started on one of those deep winter nights. The city was quiet, eerily so. You could almost feel the stillness pressing down, heavy and suffocating. I'd been stuck working late that Thursday because of some ridiculous software glitch during the quarterly audit. Apparently, our system had decided that numbers were optional, and fixing it had fallen squarely on my shoulders. Lucky me, right? By midnight, I was the last person left in the building, or at least I thought I was. Linwood wasn't exactly the kind of place you'd want to hang out in after hours. The building had this cold, clinical vibe. Beige walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, and an air conditioning system that always seemed to be fighting a losing battle, whether it was winter or summer. During the day, it was tolerable, but at night, it felt different. The silence wasn't just silence. It was this heavy, oppressive thing that made you hyper-aware of every little noise. I was at my desk, facing a wall of windows that looked out over the parking lot. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, blanketing everything in this perfect, untouched white. My car was the only one out there, sitting under a layer of snow so thick you could barely tell it was a Honda. Beyond the lot, the empty street stretched into darkness, the occasional streetlight casting pale pools of light. Even the snowplows had called it quits, leaving the world outside looking abandoned, almost frozen in time. Inside, the office wasn't much better. The heating system was doing its best, but it felt like the cold was winning. I was bundled up in my oversized coat with a scarf wrapped around my neck like a makeshift blanket, sipping on yet another cup of instant coffee. It wasn't good coffee, but it was warm, and at that point, that was all I cared about. I was staring at my screen, half-heartedly scrolling through audit logs for what felt like the 100th time, when I heard it, a faint creak, just a little sound, like a door easing open somewhere, far down the hallway. At first, I brushed it off. Old buildings make noise, right? The heating ducts groan, the walls settle, and sometimes the wind sneaks in through tiny cracks you didn't know were there. But something about this sound stuck with me. It wasn't random. It had a rhythm, a deliberate quality. Like someone had opened a door carefully, trying not to be heard. I told myself I was imagining things and went back to my work, but a few minutes later, I heard it again. Louder this time. Closer. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The only sounds were the soft hum of my computer and the faint buzz of the overhead lights. I glanced at the clock. 12:13 a.m. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not the bravest person in the world. My first instinct was to just sit there and pretend I hadn't heard anything. Maybe if I ignored it, it would go away. But the more I sat there, the more uneasy I felt. My mind started racing. What if someone had broken in? What if it wasn't just the building making noises? Eventually, curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I pushed back my chair, grabbed my phone for light, and stepped into the hallway. The hallway was long and dimly lit, with that sterile, fluorescent glow that always makes things look just a little creepier. The walls were lined with motivational posters, the kind with stock photos of mountains and sunsets, and they seemed almost mocking in the eerie light. My footsteps echoed as I made my way toward the break room, which is where the sound had seemed to come from. When I got there, the door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see a sliver of the room beyond. It was dark inside, except for the faint glow of the vending machines in the corner. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. No answer. I nudged the door open with my foot, half expecting to find the room empty. Instead, I saw him, Elliot. He was crouched by the garbage bins, his back to me. Even from behind, I recognized him instantly. He was hard to miss. Tall, wiry, always wearing that same ratty blue jacket no matter how cold it got. But what struck me wasn't his presence. It was what he was doing. He was rummaging through the trash, his gloved hands sifting through the garbage with this almost manic focus. His movements were jerky, and I could hear him muttering under his breath, though I couldn't make out the words. "Elliot?" I said cautiously. He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. For a moment, I wondered if he'd heard me at all. But then, slowly, he turned to look at me. And that's when I felt it, that deep, instinctive chill that tells you something is very, very wrong. His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes, God, his eyes. They were wide and glassy, like he'd been staring into the void for too long. His gloves were smeared with coffee grounds, or at least I hoped it was coffee, and he was clutching a crumpled piece of paper in one hand like it was the most important thing in the world. "I didn't think anyone was here," he mumbled, his voice low and uneven. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. For a moment, he just stared at me, blinking slowly, like he was processing the question. Then he shoved the paper into his pocket, stood up, and brushed past me without another word. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the garbage bins, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. Over the next few days, I started noticing things, little details I hadn't paid attention to before. The garbage bins were always empty in the mornings, no matter how full they'd been the night before. And it wasn't just cleaning. Elliot was taking things. I couldn't let it go. I started marking papers and throwing them away. Doodles, notes, meaningless scraps. And every single time, those marked papers disappeared. Eventually, I decided to stay late again and figure out what was going on. This time, I was ready. What happened that night, though, is a story for another time. All I can say is, I never looked at late nights in an empty office the same way again. Winter nights in Briar Hollow weren't just cold. They were the kind of cold that sank deep into your bones. No amount of layers or hot drinks seemed to help. And the firehouse, as much as I loved the place, was no refuge. It was an old building, full of charm but terrible at keeping out the drafts. The wind found its way in through every crack and crevice, rattling the windows and creeping under the bay doors like a ghost. We had a space heater in the lounge, but calling it effective would have been generous. It barely managed to warm a 5-foot radius, leaving the rest of the room an icy wasteland. Most nights, I'd wrap myself in my thickest coat, curl my fingers around a chipped mug of coffee that tasted faintly of burnt plastic, and watch the snow collect against the frosted windows. The quiet on those nights was almost eerie, like the world outside had been put on mute. No cars, no voices, just the occasional groan of the old building and the whisper of snow against the glass. But that particular night was different. I couldn't put my finger on why, but the stillness in the firehouse felt heavier than usual, almost oppressive. It was the kind of silence that made you strain your ears for something, anything, to break it, even if it was just the faint hum of the heater or the creak of someone's boots. I didn't know it then, but that night would change the way I saw everything. It was the night I truly saw Lester for who he was. Lester had been at the firehouse longer than anyone. Longer than I'd been alive, probably. He wasn't just part of the crew, he was the firehouse. The old-timers spoke about him like he was a legend. Stories of how he'd pulled a kid from a house seconds before the roof caved in, or held a hose steady when the rest of the crew could barely stand. Stuff that sounded almost too heroic to be real, though no one dared question it. Even after all these years, Lester still worked the night shifts. It didn't seem to bother him, though. "Can't sleep much anyway," he'd say with a shrug, cradling his mug of black coffee like it was his lifeline. He always looked tired, but not in the way most people did after a bad night's sleep. It was deeper than that, like he was carrying something heavier than exhaustion. We didn't talk much, Lester and me. He wasn't rude, just quiet. He moved around the firehouse like a shadow, appearing and disappearing without a sound. He had this way of looking at you too, like he was searching for something you didn't even know you had. The other guys brushed it off. "That's just Lester," they'd say. But it unnerved me. It was like he knew something the rest of us didn't, and he wasn't about to share. It was a little after midnight when the call came in. I remember because I'd just settled into the recliner in the lounge, trying to shake off the creeping chill. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, tense but clear. A house fire on the far edge of town. The family had made it out, thank God, but the urgency in her voice told me this wasn't going to be a quick job. Lester was already in his gear by the time I made it to the bay. He didn't say a word, just climbed into the truck and started the engine. The snow was coming down hard by then, thick flakes swirling in the headlights as we pulled out onto the road. The tires crunched over the ice, the truck fishtailing slightly on the slick pavement. My fingers dug into the armrest as Lester took a corner a little too fast, but he didn't seem the least bit concerned. His hands were steady on the wheel, his eyes locked on the road ahead like he wasn't seeing the snow at all, just the fire waiting for us on the other side. When we arrived, the house was already half consumed. Flames licked at the night sky, sending up plumes of smoke that glowed orange against the snow. The heat was intense, even from a distance. The kind that prickled your skin and made the air taste metallic. The family stood huddled together on the sidewalk, wrapped in blankets that didn't seem to be doing much to stop their shivering. Their faces were pale, streaked with tears, their eyes fixed on the inferno that had been their home just hours earlier. I jumped out of the truck, ready to grab the hose, but Lester stopped me with a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, his eyes calm. Too calm. "Wait," he said. I frowned, glancing back at the house. "What do you mean, wait? There's nothing left to save," he interrupted, his voice steady but cold. "The family's safe. The fire's already won." His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to argue. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that we could still do something, anything. But when I looked back at the house, at the flames devouring what was left of the roof, I realized he was right. Still, the way he said it, so detached, almost like he enjoyed watching it burn, made my stomach twist. Back at the firehouse, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way Lester had stood there, staring at the flames like they were speaking to him. It wasn't normal, it wasn't right. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it, that he was just a seasoned firefighter who'd seen enough to know when a battle was lost. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. A faint scraping sound, barely audible over the creaks of the old building. At first I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the bay, the beam cutting through the darkness as I followed the sound. My breath fogged in the freezing air, my boots crunching softly against the concrete floor. When I turned the corner, I froze. There, crouched by one of the trucks, was Lester. He was holding a tin can, pouring its contents onto a bundle of rags. The sharp chemical smell hit me like a slap, and I realized, with a jolt of horror, that it was kerosene. "Lester," I said, my voice trembling, "what the hell are you doing?" He didn't answer right away, just struck a match and held it above the rags, his hand steady as a rock. The tiny flame flickered, its light dancing in his hollow eyes. "Fire purifies," he said finally, his voice low, almost reverent. It reveals the truth. My heart pounded as I lunged forward, knocking the match from his hand. It hit the ground and sputtered out, but the smell of kerosene lingered, thick and choking. Lester turned to face me then, and the look in his eyes made my blood run cold. They weren't the eyes of the man I thought I knew. They were empty, like the flames had burned away whatever humanity he'd won. "You don't understand," he said, his tone eerily calm. "This town, it's rotting. The fire cleanses it. It cleanses me." "Lester, you're not well," I managed, my voice shaking. "You need help." He smiled then, a slow, chilling smile that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm not sick. I'm free." The next morning, I handed everything over to the chief, the rags, the kerosene, and the journal I'd found in Lester's locker. It was filled with rambling notes and diagrams, sketches of fires he'd set over the years, fires I'd responded to, fires that had destroyed homes, businesses, lives. The police arrested him later that day. He didn't resist, didn't say a word as they led him out in cuffs. But as he passed me, he leaned in close. "You'll see," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "The fire will call to you too." I quit the fire department that week, moved out of Briar Hollow by spring. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream of flames, roaring, consuming flames, and wake up to the phantom smell of smoke lingering in the air. The snow had been coming down steadily all day, and by the time my evening shift started at Maple Hollow Cafe, everything outside was coated in a thick, sparkling blanket. The streets were nearly deserted, just the occasional car creeping by, tires crunching over the snow, and a couple of bundled-up pedestrians hurrying past with their heads down. Inside, it was warm, the air thick with the smell of roasted coffee beans and the faint sweetness of pastries. Cozy in theory, but in practice, with no one around, it felt a little too quiet, almost unnervingly so. I worked the evening shift most days, 5 p.m. to closing, which was usually fine. It gave me plenty of time to catch up on schoolwork when things were slow. And honestly, I liked the solitude. The cafe had this big bay window that overlooked the main street. And on snowy nights like this, I could sit behind the counter with a mug of something warm and watch the snow pile up, feeling like the whole world was frozen in time. But there was a flip side to the stillness. On nights when the streets were empty and the sidewalks untouched, it was easy to feel exposed, vulnerable even, like the silence was too big to fill and any noise could shatter it. The cafe was dead that night, not a single customer in hours. I was halfway through wiping down the counters for what felt like the 100th time when the door chimed. The sound startled me. It was so loud in the quiet, I actually jumped a little. I turned toward the door, and there he was. He came in with the kind of force that demanded attention, stomping snow off his boots and shaking himself off like a wet dog. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and bundled up in a heavy parka with the hood pulled tight around his face. As he unwound his scarf, I recognized him immediately, not because I knew his name or anything, but because he'd been coming in almost every week for months now. The Americano with no room guy. The one who never smiled and never made small talk but always watched me like he was trying to figure me out. The one who gave me that uneasy feeling I could never quite shake. I forced a smile, though my hands were suddenly clammy against the counter. "Americano?" I asked, keeping my tone as neutral as possible. He nodded, pulling off his gloves. His hands were bright red from the cold, the knuckles dry and cracked. He flexed his fingers a couple of times like they were stiff, and I couldn't help but notice how rough they looked. It was such a small thing, but it made me feel, I don't know, uneasy maybe, vulnerable. As I started making his drink, I could feel his eyes on me. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed it. He had this way of watching people, like he was dissecting them with his gaze. Normally I could brush it off, but tonight, with the cafe so quiet and the snowstorm muffling everything outside, it felt different, more intense. When I handed him the cup, he didn't take it right away. Instead, he leaned forward on the counter, close enough that I could see the way his breath fogged the air between us. "Cold out there," he said, his voice low and rough, like he hadn't spoken all day. "Sure is. I replied, taking a step back without even meaning to. Finally, he took the cup, his gloved hand brushing mine in the process. The touch was brief, but it made my skin crawl. He didn't leave, though. Instead, he just stood there, sipping his coffee and watching me like he was waiting for something. "You work here a lot, don't you?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I nodded, pretending to busy myself with wiping down the espresso machine. "Yeah, most nights. How late are you here tonight?" The question was casual enough on the surface, but there was something about the way he said it that made my stomach tighten. I hesitated, trying to think of a way to deflect without outright lying. "We close at 10, I said finally. "Alone?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "No," I said quickly, my voice a little too sharp. "The manager's in the back." He nodded, taking another sip of his coffee. "Good. You shouldn't be out here alone. It's not safe." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. He smiled then, a slow, deliberate smile that didn't reach his eyes. I forced a laugh, the sound hollow even to me. "Well, it's a pretty quiet neighborhood," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Not much happens around here." He didn't respond, just kept watching me with that same unsettling intensity. Finally, he moved to his usual spot in the corner, the one where he could see the entire cafe, and me. I let out a shaky breath, trying to focus on closing tasks, but it was impossible to ignore him. Every time I glanced his way, his eyes were on me, unblinking. By 9:45, my nerves were shot. I ducked into the back and called my manager, hoping he might swing by early to help me close up. No answer. Rosa, my coworker, had called out sick, so I really was alone. I debated locking the doors early, just this once, but I didn't want to risk getting in trouble. Instead, I tried to keep myself busy, counting down the minutes until closing. At 9:55, he got up and came back to the counter. His boots were loud against the floor, each step making my chest tighten a little more. "Can I get a refill?" he asked, holding out his cup. "Sure," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My hands were trembling as I poured the coffee, and I hoped he didn't notice. "You're really pretty, you know that?" he said suddenly, his voice soft, but too close. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Thanks," I mumbled, keeping my eyes on the coffee pot. When I handed the cup back, he didn't take it. Instead, he grabbed my wrist, his grip firm but not painful. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said again, his tone almost gentle. "Anything could happen to a girl like you." I yanked my hand back, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "I think you should go now," I said, trying to sound firm but failing miserably. He chuckled, the sound low and rumbling. "Relax," he said, his smile widening. "I'm just looking out for you." I stepped back, putting as much distance between us as I could. "Please leave," I said, louder this time. For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he set the cup down and walked out. The bell over the door jingled softly as he left, but the sound didn't bring any relief. I locked the door the second he was gone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key, but when I glanced out the window, my stomach dropped. He was still there, standing across the street under a lamppost. The faint glow of a cigarette lit up his face, and he was watching me. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but where? My bike was locked up outside, and there was no way I was going out there now. Instead, I ducked into the back and called the police, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. By the time they arrived, he was gone. The cigarette was still smoldering on the sidewalk, but there was no sign of him. The officers took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. "Call us if he comes back," one of them said, handing me a card. I didn't sleep that night. For weeks after, every time the door chimed, my heart would leap into my throat. That night was in the middle of one of the coldest winters I can remember, back when I was working the night shift at Halcyon Manufacturing. I've had my fair share of weird experiences, but this one, well, this one still gives me the creeps. Halcyon was one of those old industrial factories that felt like it belonged to another time. Everything about it was dated, faded yellow warning signs, heavy machinery that roared like dinosaurs, and this constant hum from the generators that you didn't notice until you left and realized just how loud it had been. Even the smell of the place seemed ancient, a mix of oil, burnt metal, and something musty that clung to your clothes long after you left. The kind of place you never really felt comfortable in, especially during the night shift. That night I was working alone on line 4. They'd been short-staffed for weeks, so being alone wasn't exactly unusual. Honestly, I didn't mind it most of the time. I could just keep my head down, get through my work, and leave without any interruptions. The less interaction, the better. But when you're alone in a place like that, with the dark pressing against the windows and the cold seeping in from every corner, it does something to you. Makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every shadow. And that night, it felt different. Heavier somehow, like the factory itself was watching. Around 11 p.m., Greg, my shift supervisor, came by. Greg was, well, he wasn't exactly a people person. He was one of those guys who always seemed tired, like life had just worn him down. He had this battered clipboard that looked like it'd been through a war, and he was always muttering to himself, like he was doing some kind of mental math. He wasn't a bad guy, but he wasn't the kind to hang around and chat either. "Sorry, you sure?" Greg asked. "You good here, Sam?" he asked, barely glancing up from his clipboard. His voice had this gravelly tone, like he'd smoked half a pack before coming over. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, pulling my gloves tighter. The cold had been creeping in for hours, and even with the machines running, you could still see your breath if you stood in the wrong spot. "All right, holler if you need anything," he mumbled, already walking off. Classic Greg, always available, but never really there when you needed him. Not that I blamed him, it wasn't exactly his dream job either. Still, I remember watching him leave and feeling this strange twinge of, I don't know, maybe it was just the silence getting to me. For the next hour or so, I settled into the rhythm of the line. It was repetitive work, but there was something almost meditative about it. The clink of metal, the steady hiss of the machines. It was like white noise from my brain. But even as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The factory felt too quiet, even with the machines running. Normally, you'd hear faint sounds from other lines, voices, footsteps, the occasional laugh. But that night, it was just me, alone in this cavernous, echoing space. Then, just before midnight, I saw him. At first, I thought I was imagining things. I was focused on my work, hands moving automatically, when something caught my eye. Movement. I glanced up and saw a figure standing near the supply room door. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, half hidden in the shadows. He was wearing a hoodie, the hood pulled up so I couldn't see his face. My first thought was that it was someone from maintenance, maybe they'd come to grab a tool or something. But the longer I looked, the less sense it made. He wasn't moving, he wasn't looking for anything, he was just standing there, completely still. "Hey," I called out, raising my voice over the noise of the machines. "You need something?" No response. I frowned and stopped the line, letting the machinery wind to a halt. The sudden silence was jarring, like someone had sucked all the air out of the room. "You okay?" I tried again, stepping closer. He didn't say a word. Instead, he moved, slowly, almost deliberately, sideways, slipping into the supply room. The heavy door clicked shut behind him. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding. Something about the whole thing felt wrong. Like, really wrong. I told myself he was probably just shy, or maybe he hadn't heard me. But the longer I stood there, staring at that door, the more uneasy I felt. Eventually I shook it off, restarted the line, and tried to focus on my work. But I couldn't. No matter how hard I tried, my mind kept drifting back to the man in the hoodie. Every little sound made me jump, the hiss of the machines, the creak of the floor, even my own footsteps. I found myself glancing at the supply room door every few minutes, half expecting it to swing open. But it didn't. At one point, I thought I heard a faint noise behind me, like the soft scrape of a shoe against concrete. My stomach dropped, and I froze, wrench in hand. Slowly, I turned, scanning the floor. The shadows seemed darker now, deeper, like they were hiding something. But when I looked closer, there was nothing there, just empty space. "Pull it together, Sam," I muttered under my breath. I tried to laugh it off, but it sounded hollow, even to me. Around 1:30, Greg came back, holding a cup of coffee that smelled like burnt dirt. He was trying to quit smoking and the coffee was his substitute, though he drank it like it was punishment. "How's it going?" he asked, yawning mid-sentence. "Fine," I said, hesitating. "Hey, did you send anyone to the supply room earlier?" Greg frowned, lowering his cup. "No. Why?" "There was someone there earlier," I said. "A guy in a hoodie. He didn't say anything, just went in." Greg's face darkened. "Nobody's supposed to be in there. You sure you saw someone?" I nodded. "I'm sure." He grabbed his radio and called it in. A few minutes later, Miguel, the night security guard, showed up. Miguel was a no-nonsense guy, the kind of person you'd want with you in a bad situation. He gave me a quick nod and headed for the supply room. When he came back, he looked annoyed. "Room's clear," he said. "Door was locked when I got there." "What?" I blurted out. "That's impossible. I saw him go in there." Miguel shrugged. "No sign of anyone." Greg gave me a look, the kind that said, "Are you sure you're not losing it?" "I'm not imagining this," I said firmly. The rest of the shift was a blur. Every creak, every shadow felt like a threat. Once, I thought I saw him again, standing near the loading dock, but when I turned to look, he was gone. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was exhausted. The walk to my car was cold and quiet, the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. When I got in and locked the doors, I noticed it immediately. Sitting on the passenger seat was a single bolt, one of the bolts we used on line 4.I. Hadn't put it there. The next day, Greg told me the cameras in the supply room had been tampered with. Wires cut clean, the feed dead for hours. No one ever figured out who the guy was or how he got in. Management chalked it up to a random incident, a fluke. But I couldn't. Even now, years later, when winter comes and the nights grow long, I think about him. The way he stood there, watching. The bolt on my seat. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed just a little longer that night. Honestly, I don't think I want to know. I was huddled behind the counter, nursing my fourth, or was it fifth, cup of coffee, trying to stay awake. Outside, the street was almost eerily quiet. No cars passing by, no footsteps, nothing. Just the faint hum of the store's freezer and the occasional groan of the heater struggling to keep the place warm. The minutes crawled by. Night shifts were always like this. Long, slow stretches of silence interrupted by the occasional customer. Usually it was the same types. Truckers looking for caffeine to stay awake, students grabbing snacks, or the rare straggler who made you keep one hand near the panic button just in case. You get used to it though. You stop expecting anything out of the ordinary. So, when the doorbell jingled, my first reaction was pure autopilot. Glance up, say welcome, and go back to pretending to organize the scratch-off tickets. But then I saw them. Two women walked in, and right away something about them made me pause. The first one caught my attention immediately. She was about my age, maybe a little younger, with a round face framed by loose, wind-blown strands of hair. Her cheeks were flushed bright red from the cold, and she was bundled up in this enormous scarf that looked like it could double as a blanket. It made her seem smaller somehow, like she was trying to wrap herself up and disappear into it. She had this kind of familiar look, like someone I might have passed in the halls at school years ago, but never really talked to. The second woman followed close behind, just a step or two back. She was older, not by much, but enough to carry herself differently. Where the first woman seemed eager, almost bouncing on her feet as she walked in, this one was calm, too calm. Her movements were deliberate, her eyes scanning the store like she was taking everything in at once. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it put me on edge. She didn't look like someone out for a midnight snack. She looked like someone with a purpose. "Hey," the first girl said brightly, her voice cutting through the quiet. She smiled at me, wide and warm, like we were old friends catching up. "Didn't we have gym class together back in school?" "Gym class? Really? Who remembers gym class that clearly?" I blinked at her, caught off guard. Maybe?" I said, my tone uncertain. "I left school senior year." Her smile didn't waver. If anything, it got bigger, like she'd just confirmed something important. "That's right. I think I remember that," she said, taking a step closer to the counter. The older woman followed, silent and watchful like a shadow. "So, how have you been? Are you in college now?" I shrugged, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Not really, just working for now." She nodded like she completely understood. "Yeah, I get that. It's been a weird couple of years, huh?" There was something about the way she said it, too smooth, too practiced, that set off a little warning bell in my head. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she delivered them, like she'd said this exact sentence 100 times before. I tried to shake it off. Maybe she was just one of those overly friendly people who didn't realize they were coming on too strong. Still, I couldn't ignore the slight tightening in my stomach, that instinctual feeling that something wasn't quite right. The older woman finally spoke then, her voice low and calm, almost soothing. "You know," she said, leaning lightly on the counter, "it's funny how God brings people together." I froze for a split second, not sure how to respond. Yeah, I guess." The first girl's face lit up like I'd just handed her the winning lottery ticket. "Exactly," she said, her voice practically bubbling over. "That's how we feel too. We've both been through so much, but finding our church, it's completely changed everything." And there it was. I could feel it coming, this slow, inevitable shift in the conversation, like watching a storm roll in from miles away. "That's nice," I said, trying to sound polite but uninterested. I figured they'd get the hint. They didn't. If anything, my response seemed to energize her. She launched into this story about how lost she used to feel, how she'd put on a happy face but wasn't really happy at all. She talked about a knee injury, said she'd prayed about it and it had healed miraculously. Her voice was smooth, almost hypnotic, the kind of voice that draws you in before you realize what's happening. The older woman chimed in here and there, adding little details about her own struggles, depression, anxiety, all the heavy stuff, and how their church had given her true peace. The air in the store felt heavier with every word they spoke, like it was pressing down on me. It wasn't just a conversation, it was a pitch, a practiced routine, and I was the target. And the way they looked at me, wide-eyed and earnest, made my skin crawl. It wasn't just friendly, it was something deeper, something more intense. Like they saw me as a puzzle piece they needed to complete. You know, the older woman said, leaning in just slightly. "God led us here tonight. It's not a coincidence that we met you. You wanted us to find you." I glanced at the clock, silently begging for someone else to walk in. A truck driver, a college kid, anyone. "That's interesting," I muttered, grabbing my water bottle just to have something to do with my hands. The younger girl reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a card. She slid it across the counter, her smile turning almost conspiratorial. "You should come," she said, her voice dropping like she was letting me in on a secret. "It's not like other churches. God is there, like really there, in the flesh." I let out a nervous laugh before I could stop myself. "What do you mean, in the flesh?" Her smile didn't falter. "You'll see. You just have to come." The older woman leaned closer, her tone soft but insistent. "You don't have to feel like this anymore. God has something better for you. We can show you." "Feel like what?" I wanted to ask, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I muttered something about being busy and slid the card back toward them. "Thanks, but I'm good." For a split second, their smiles faltered. Just a flicker, but it was enough to tell me they weren't used to being turned down. The older woman picked up the card and slipped it back into her pocket, her expression tightening slightly. "Well, if you ever change your mind, we're here." With that, they turned and walked out into the freezing night. I watched them through the glass as they stood by the gas pumps, talking to a man who'd just pulled in. Same smiles, same wide eyes, same gestures. They were already working on their next target, and the rest of my shift passed in a blur, but I couldn't stop replaying the encounter in my head. Was it some kind of cult, a scam, or just two overly zealous churchgoers who didn't know how to take no for an answer? Whatever it was, it didn't feel right. When my shift finally ended and I stepped out into the bitter cold, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd dodged something dangerous. Something that, if I'd let it, would have sunk its claws in and never let go.